us off to Tracy.
Thank you, David. Just to give you a little background, Tom and I can't believe 10 years has gone by, but Tom and I first met when I was on my first board, and we, at my request, invited Tom to come in and do some strategic planning. So thank you, Tom, for this opportunity. I was recently in a meeting with a CEO, and we were talking about my work as a board advisory consultant, and I shared with her about the strategic planning I help boards with and the different tools of board evaluation that we have and some of the issues that I help boards with. And she asked me a question that really got me to thinking. She said, well, what kind of business are you really in? And I took a pause and thought about it, and I said, well, I'm in the business of adding competitive advantage to the top of the house. So I went on to tell her a story that exemplifies some of the aspects of being in a boardroom, and I want to share that story with you tonight. And I even brought some show and tell, because I heard you were such a friendly crowd. So you're gonna learn. I dug this out of my memory box in my writing. I was about 12 years old. So I'll share with you how I got this ribbon. But some of you may know I'm a Colorado native, and I was raised in the country. And I have great memories of the animals and the competitions that we had. And we competed in what's called omoxies and gymkhanas, and they're just like mini rodeos. So one of the best competitions I was in the rescue race, and that's how I got this ribbon. And the rescue race is such that in the arena, like when you go see a rodeo, there are two barrels at the opposing ends of the stadium, maybe 20 or 25% of the way in. And basically, a horse and a rider starts at one end, and they run all the way past the first barrel, towards the second barrel, almost to the end, and the person that needs to be rescued is standing by that second barrel. So the rider leans down and literally throws that person on the horse. The horse, hopefully it's a good cutting horse, cuts that barrel, and you run back. And I think this happened on this race in 11.8 seconds. So the characters in this story are Russie, who was my neighbor, and Russie and I grew up together, and she was a few years older than I was, and she was this really big, burly woman, and perfect for the rescue race. But she was almost masculine to the point where she scared men. And it was, and I'm not saying that in a bad way. I mean, she was a perfect match for me, partly because, you know, she was like larger than life, and maybe you had some friends like that when you were growing up. But I really looked up to her, and we were so well put together for the rescue race because while she was really large and burly, I was this 90-pound soaking wet, very curious-eyed, young person with long, straggly blonde hair. And I was thrilled to be a part of this with her. We were both very competitive. But the third party in this story is her horse named Napoleon, and that horse was more competitive than the two of us put together, I swear to you. He was a winner. But Russie's father had spent a considerable amount of money on buying her this quarter horse, fully registered. He stood maybe 15 or 16 hands, so he was a really big horse and fast. And he was beautiful. He was a regal animal, deep chocolate brown. He had these golden eyes that almost blazed, especially when he was running at you. So, and he had a mane that started dark and then moved to lighter colors. And so when he ran, he looked just like a bolt of lightning. So come with me as I tell you this story about the rescue race. And it's a summer evening, and you're at the arena, and the sun is starting to set. There's a whiff of manure and popcorn in the air, because that's exactly what it smelled like. And come with me down to where we staged, because this is where my experience in the rescue race started. So at the very far end of the arena, we would line up, those of us who were competing, and the clowns, you know, they'd clear all the equipment from the last race, and they'd put the barrels out, and we'd get called up. So we'd get a cue, and I'd begin, as the person who's going to be rescued, walking. I'd walk across the first barrel, and I'd look over and I'd see in the stands all the people and their children, feel their eyes on me. And I would turn and position myself strategically, I hope, on that second barrel, because what will happen, as you know, once the gun goes off, Napoleon and Russie come running full blast to pick me up. And I can't tell you the feelings of kind of fear and trepidation and excitement all at the same time as this begins to happen. So when the horse then runs down, and Russie, being the strong woman that she is, picks me up and throws me over. And my feeling from fear and in anticipation moves into much like somewhat of a graceful, almost smooth feeling as she lifts me up and I land on the horse. It reminds me of Shaun White, the snowboarder, who speaks about when he does the tubes and he practices, and he says, when I'm done going up and I'm not going down, it's like I'm flying. And that's what it felt like. There was such coordination, because we practiced this, believe me. And that horse could cut that barrel, and so in other words, work with the environment that he had and us two girls. And so I would have just a split second of this feeling of coordination and rhythm, and wham! I'd land on that horse. And a really good cutting barrel horse can take off like lightning when they turn around that barrel. So I would come in behind my girlfriend and hold on to her for dear life as we headed home to win many of these. So I tell you that story because in many ways the boardroom is like that. And as I walked across to the barrel and looked up and saw the audience watching me and how I'll perform, that's much like shareholders. If you serve on a public company board, you're representing them, and they will watch how you perform. And then when I stood and we had that time of coordination, I see boards operate like that. Not always, but when they come together and can really debate and then decide and move forward, there is that sense of coordination. And maybe when the horse is coming at you, that could be like our current business environment with its many complexities. And as a director, you don't want to contract. You're at the top of the house. You should be able to stay in an oversight position. And how about looking for opportunities in some of the crises that we have? So the last piece that reminds me of a board is when I land on that horse and go from the smooth ride to the bumpy and holding on for your dear life. And sometimes when we practice, I'd be hanging on the side. And many times I got thrown all the way over because my girlfriend was so strong. But that in some ways represents what I might consider a problem era, the last 10 years. Just when we feel like we're getting settled in, we have another crisis. So keep that in mind tonight as we go through. I've got just a few slides, and then we'll take a break and the panel will come up. But keep that in mind as you think about the expertise that you have. And some of you may already be serving on boards. Some of you may come tonight to learn about what it might be like, and maybe I might be a candidate. And think about the challenges that are on the forefront for this country and how you might add value. Some of the challenges are listed here. I've just got 6. The first one, globalization. There is such a sense of frailty after the financial meltdown of 2008, and I'm sure you talk about it in some of your other meetings, But there's a sense that we're integrated. I must have hit the wrong button. There we go. There's a sense that we're integrated in a way that we weren't before, or we didn't have awareness before, and that is still being worked out. Revolutionary technologies. Right now in labs across the country, they are working to reproduce human organs. So if your liver's bad, you could get a new liver. I mean, this is an incredible time we're living in. Medical miracles and ethical nightmares, we all know about that with certain wars that go on, genocides. New dynamics in aging and migration. I was just talking with Tom, and as a futurist, he is thinking that maybe America, with our low birth rate, that might be a strategic initiative for us to look at, especially if you don't have a workforce and a population. Global systematic risk. This one with climate and disease. Obviously, you've seen some of this on the news. And then ideas and eco-affluence or eco-collapse. So even this slide gives you some idea, especially for larger companies, of the issues that we're going to be facing. Board-specific challenges. After the financial meltdown of 2008, we began to hear about patient capital and what that is. So you have the short-term versus the long-term capital, and how will we move forward? How will maybe even the government incentivize us to be more patient? Dispersed ownership versus concentrated ownership. So maybe you become a candidate to serve on a company board. You can ask to see how many of those shareholders are retail owners, maybe like you and I, or institutional shareholders. And you can ask what those concerns are, because that company should know, especially if they have activist shareholders or institutional shareholders. Usually there's communication, and that'll be increasing. So you should know that, what those concerns are. And this last one, don't ask, don't tell, is we're going to be talking about some of the pending legislation, and it is definitely a hot spot right now with transparency and disclosure. Every year, PricewaterhouseCoopers and the corporate board member does a survey. It's called What Directors Think, and these top three are the concerns. Obviously, strategy. Directors are concerned that their strategy is appropriate. The risk appetite is appropriate for the company, and serving on the audit committee. So as you look at this slide, again, think about your experience and how you might be able to add value there. In visiting with headhunters, as well as attending different events and webinars, this is some of the ways that the professional people that place directors are looking at. They're looking at more than just the people that we think are traditionally on boards. People that are experienced business leaders. There's fewer active CEOs, and CEOs are limiting themselves for a number of reasons to serving on usually 1 to 2 boards. They're also looking at recruitment of more than just the C-suite, up and coming people. Functional leaders in key areas. Tonight, Jack Rizzo's with us, and his board at Prologis has a standing sustainability committee. So the other creative thinkers I have listed there. But one interesting example, last year I read about Harvard has a new database, and Tom and I were talking about this, and it's called the Super Director. And while in some sense it smacks of elitism, it is a database of individuals that they hope to put together who could question a CEO on every aspect of a company's strategic plan. So that gives you an example of the opening that's coming. And I would propose to you, wouldn't it be a novel idea maybe for Colorado to have a database of directors who know a lot about sustainability and have worked at an executive level? New expectations. As you look at the slide, think about, again, where are areas that you could contribute to this. Compensation, I just read an article in the Wall Street Journal. HR people from large companies like GE are being recruited to sit in the boardroom and deal with the compensation issues, deal with pay issues, deal with succession planning issues, strategic thinking and guidance, industry knowledge. This next one, evaluation of risk and risk management. This is on a lot of directors' minds, especially after the meltdown of 2008. There will even be possibilities that disclosure of a director's background and their experience with assessing risk would be part of your bio on the proxy access. So board leadership experience and obviously who you are also is part of the equation of who gets asked to be on boards. Some of the challenges that the executive recruiters are facing, and there are many, we are facing the largest exit of directors in the US history with baby boomers, just think about it. So they're concerned though that out of all these, the last one, risk aversion, that directors will, because of the increased scrutiny at the board level as well as the legal liability or the possibility of legal liability, they're concerned that it'll keep qualified directors away. Well, what that means to some people is that it's an opportunity for you if you're willing to take that kind of position. Finding the right people, they need people that have the right kind of qualifications, and sometimes what boards will do is like a matrice when they look at competencies and experience that they want for directors, and they'll do the board members' last names maybe on the left-hand column, and across the top they'll put different competencies or skills, finance and some of the others that you can think about, and they'll check the boxes. And they'll also, if they're future planning, have future needs. So the next step, where's the company going? And after they've completed checking the boxes that are emptied can be part of the way the next candidate is chosen. The new protocols, longer-term succession planning for boards, and this is being driven obviously by the need. More detailed director specifications, including your skills and your personal dynamics. More rigorous recruitment process, this idea of overboarding directors. How many boards does a director sit on? In the world of shareholder activists and proxy access companies, they watch and follow this and can advise a withhold vote if they feel like it's too many. And one of the big players in this is RiskMetrics. And RiskMetrics is a proxy advisory firm, and so they recommend about 6 boards, no more than 6 boards for a director to sit on. Mary Beth Vitale is with us tonight, and she is a professional director, so you can ask questions later about what that is, much like the Harvard database. How many boards does a director who's a professional director sit on, and how do they manage that schedule? More rigorous renomination and evaluation process. Again, this goes back to the shareholder activists and the governance organizations that really look at boards and critique them. And if they have certain guidelines that they produce and update every year, and if you don't meet those, let's say 6 or fewer boards, you attend 75% of the meetings, there's a whole variety of them, they recommend a withhold vote on you. And then background checks. And background checks as far as legally, December 16th, the SEC had a new disclosure rule, and the legal portions will go from 5 to 10 years now. So just out of curiosity, how many of you receive in the mail a proxy access? That's great. Okay. How many of you vote? Very good. Okay, very good. All right, so what is different in this role of the board? I was at a fall KPMG audit committee roundtable meeting. They have 2 of them a year. And they have some in Denver, and they have them across the country. And it was very interesting because the conversation at that meeting was such that I had never heard in the flavors of we need to have our boardroom meetings be more dynamic, less canned presentations to us, and we need to have more expertise from the board drawn out, rather than just relying so much on the senior management. So again, back to the idea of value add, competitive advantage from the top of the house. And you can see through here, the third one down, the governance committee, many of the pending legislations will do probably to the governance committee as far as ramping up work, much what Sarbanes-Oxley did to the audit committee, and it ramped up the work there for the audit committee. So a lot of the pending legislation, which this year in 2010, there's an unprecedented amount, a lot of it's focused on board composition, board leadership, who's on the board and why, all the things that the governance committee is charged with. And you can read these others, this less CEO participation in the director selection, depending on who you talk to, 50% of directors now are placed by headhunters, professional placement, and the other 50% kind of a nuanced, more who you know and how you're invited. More dynamics in the meeting and a sharper focus on compliance obviously takes away from anything else. So as you look at this slide, where is it that you feel like that you can contribute? Do you have governance skills that could help a board with some of their succession planning issues and looking at board evaluation, because the governance committee is also in charge of that oftentimes? Are you the kind of person who can be independent from management and really ask the tough questions, and in a way that you have a balance of unity, but also you're not afraid to speak up? I included this slide. I just wanted to give you some idea about the coming legislation. The greater empowerment of shareholders, you probably have heard some about this with say on pay, majority voting on that one. And let me get my notes out, there's so many. Declassified boards, proxy access, and I was right, say on pay is part of this one. Probably the one that's the most concern for directors is the proxy access. This has been debated for 8 or 10 years in America, and while Canada and the UK, Britain already do some of this right now, the only people that have proxy access are the board themselves, and the nominating committee comes up with a group of possible candidates, and that's who gets on. Right now, if you're a dissident director, you have to pay for your own expenses to mail who you are out to the shareholders, and probably mail it a couple of times. Increase public disclosure about directors. This is what we talked about before with experience and qualifications and who you are, maybe going a little deeper than 5 years, maybe going back 10 years. Mandating certain board structures. Some of you may have heard this about the controversy between the separation of the roles of CEO and the chairman. Many countries, again, already do this, but in America, we keep it together, and some companies are moving to have it separated. And then lastly, mandating certain pay practices. I'm sure you've heard about this for bonuses for poor performance, removing that, and some clawback policies. Well, 2009 was a very interesting year. There were some leading practices before legislation, so pre-legislation. Time Warner published in January a policy on board leadership structure. Again, is our CEO and our chairman separate? Are they together? Why? How's the board structure set up? And then a couple months later, they posted on their website their policy on how how they're following through with that and how they're meeting it and the changes that they're making on the board, the way their business runs and why they're choosing to have the model in that manner. Healthsouth, proxy reimbursement bylaw. Healthsouth's governance committee is run by a man named Charles Elson, and Charles is one smart cookie in the corporate governance world. And he proposed to his board a bylaw which was passed. They're headquartered in Delaware. And basically the bylaw that they passed was that if you're a successful dissident director, that you would get a certain portion of your expenses reimbursed. So that really opened it up as far as, there's a lot of argument that only the elite can be on public company boards. But when the board passed this, that kind of punched a hole in that, and so it provided a manner for other people to come on that board. Right now, if the board doesn't have a policy like this, you have to pay for your own expenses, and that could be literally hundreds of thousands of dollars to do. I think last year, 2009, there was about 75 dissident or activist type director elections, and 58 of them were successful. United Health Group, very progressive. They have nominating advisory committees that are made up of shareholder activists, and they take feedback on what those activists would like to see on the board. They also have, outside of their annual shareholder meeting, they have other shareholder meetings, and you can work through their corporate secretary to have an ad hoc meeting. So again, back to that tension of the don't ask, don't tell. This is a way that boards are starting to communicate with their shareholders. After the meltdown of 2008, very interesting, unit risk reviews and senior management meetings being attended by directors, not to participate, but to learn about what's going on in the companies. And this really exemplifies some of the concerns that director has, and that is, how do we get our information? Who's giving it to us, and how much are we getting? So this shows that directors were wanting just more after that meltdown. And I skipped the New York Stock Exchange. The New York Stock Exchange is doing a completely voluntary, 30 minutes before the board meeting starts, a session on the business they're in. And even though it's completely voluntary, 100% of the board is coming. So again, it shows you that directors are concerned. And this last one, I was quite taken by this, because the idea of boards dealing with culture is to me, in my mind, is quite progressive. And some of you know from the news headlines that Henderson was an inside man, and he didn't last a year, and the board wanted things to change faster and didn't feel like he was doing that, so they fired him, or he resigned, whatever you want to say. Tom asked me to include just a couple slides on director compensation, and the National Association of Corporate Directors has an annual survey. So you can see here about 223, 225 hours a year, and a 14% increase in time over 07. 09's figures aren't out yet, and I can guarantee you they're going to be more as far as time. The second point here, even though boards are putting in more time, they're not making more money. And I found it somewhat interesting that the media they've focused in on executive pay, but they haven't focused in on director pay yet. So we'll see if that's coming. This board compensation oftentimes comes in both cash and equity, and so this slide is just the cash side. And you can see it goes from small to large, and the $75,000, $78,000 range all the way up to the $200,000 range, just in the cash compensation piece. I think the Denver Business Journal, the parent company of the Denver Business Journal, every year they publish what directors make kind of list, and you can see there the top paid directors in the country. The last slide I have is on the difference between private company boards and public company boards. And Much of what we've talked about, you can see that public company boards are obviously representing their shareholders, but also they have corporate governance, which comes in the form of SEC legislation and this year will be pending congressional legislation. So directors are really charged in that role to make sure that that kind of responsibility is happening, and that's why you're seeing some more of this communication opening up with shareholders. Maybe that didn't happen so much before. The other thing is on public company boards, there's a lot of time and responsibility as far as the committees. You'll see audit committees, governance committees, compensation committees, nominating committees, and private companies, oftentimes the whole board might be some of those committees, so you don't see that as many committees. They're also smaller. And Mary Beth's here tonight. She sits on both private and public company boards, so she can talk a little bit more about that role and some of the responsibilities with that. The other thing with private company boards, you either have one major investor or maybe a handful of major investors, and they're really quite strong board members. And they have done a lot of due diligence and know a lot about the business. So the nuances are a little bit different. Obviously, they don't have the corporate governance piece either. So they have the liberty to spend what probably is more time on strategy and the focus of value creation from that strategy. In other words, what's working and what isn't. And then oftentimes you'll see that they replace the C-suite faster than maybe a public company might do. They have a more of an integrated relationship, at least that's my observation with them. So as we talk tonight and you think about your expertise level and what kind of value you might bring to the table, some of you are probably thinking, well, you know, I really do have some of those skills, and I'm being asked to serve on company boards, and I've served on company boards before. But what about a gut check? You know, what about the right kind of person to serve on a company board? Do you have a question about that? And what might your thoughts be about that? And I would pose to you this scenario. I would like to see directors who ask a lot of questions that are specific in nature. And how about if you, for example, served on a financial company board and you had derivatives as part of your portfolio and you didn't understand them? What would you do? Would you be courageous enough to say in front of everyone, I don't understand this. We need to have a presentation at the board level. And let's say you got that presentation and you still didn't understand it. I don't understand it. What would you do? Would you ask for another presentation? Would you go educate yourself somewhere else? Would you seek the knowledge of the understanding of the company that you worked at, that you were at the board level, until you got the answer? And let's say you did get an answer. I'd like to see that. The other thing I'd like to see is people who are courageous enough to say, you know what? I don't understand this. And it's a certain percentage of our portfolio, and maybe I shouldn't be on this board. And that takes a lot of courage. I see a hand out there. The question, if I heard it right, was, do you really need to understand all the operations of the company? And that's probably, it depends on who you ask, the answer that you get to that, and our panel members can answer some of that. But I would say to you that you should be able to understand them enough to make a decision to then say to the board, is this too risky for our portfolio? What is the risk? What is the risk? Yes.
And when I asked, well, I don't understand this, and we got the presentation from a vice president, and I still didn't understand this.
Right, I believe it.
So I asked the CEO, I said, you explain it to me. Do you understand it?
That's good.
Can you explain it so I can understand it?
Good.
And he couldn't. So I said to the whole board, if our CEO can't explain this in simple enough terms that we all grasp it,
Yeah.
we should get out of this business. And we did.
You did?
Oh yeah.
You did.
Because it was very embarrassing when the CEO couldn't explain something in simple enough terms. You got all tied up in the jargon and involved. And everybody kind of just looked at each other. This ain't gonna go.
Right. Well, and I don't want to give the impression that the derivatives were the only thing for the financial meltdown. Certainly we had a perfect storm. And I don't want to oversimplify it, but great point. That's a great point. The other thing, I guess it comes to mind, my response to your comment, many of you know about Peter Drucker, right, the management guru, born in 1919, died in 2005. Before he died, he was, like we're doing tonight, broadcasting, you know, Stanford and others would have him in through broadcast. The most important thing that he was telling students, MBAs, to learn was what he called integrated thinking. Does anyone know about what that is? I just find this so fascinating because if he was alive today, he would just be like, yes. But his point being that we have so many experts, and these experts have a silo. And maybe it's marketing, and maybe it's finance, maybe it's derivatives. So we have analytical thinking and experts that come to us, and board members, even the boards I was on, we had a number of them parading in and out of the boardroom, giving us presentations. That's what you do. The problem with that, as Peter Drucker saw it, was that there's only business decisions. This is like last breathing words. I think he worked till he died. No marketing decisions, no derivative decisions, no finance decisions, only executive decisions. And wow, when I first saw that, I was like, whoa, what is he talking about? But when you think about it from a board level, that kind of integrative thinking where somewhere we make a business decision from an executive level, so to some degree we have to understand it, to your point, to some degree we have to understand it to make that executive decision. So thank you, Peter Drucker.
So what you've talked about seems to me to be impossible. If we go back to Enron, I mean, even the auditor said it was okay.
Right.
And AIG was doing credit default swaps with 100-to-1 leverage, and everybody was saying it was okay.
Right.
Because so much money was being made, it was so profitable, the bonuses were so big, there was no one that had the guts to stand up and say, hey, what are we doing?
That's right. Yeah, we're awfully self-assured when the money's coming in, aren't we?
You know, the other thing I was thinking about in this whole crisis, where all the CPA firms were. I was an accounting major actually in college, and my auditing teacher almost threw me out of the room because I said, how can you audit, how can the people that pay you, how can you be objective when you're beholden to the people that pay you? And we haven't changed that forever, and all these people were all on board and they were all making money, as this gentleman said, and we didn't care. And so when you're talking about all of this stuff, people have to be willing to take a risk and ask the tough questions. But hey, if I'm making $200,000 as a board member, why rock the boat? It's $200,000 and I'm only doing 4 weeks worth of work.
Well, a couple of points to that. At this point about transparency and who we hire for companies and what else they do, the latest is the compensation consultants. There needs to be disclosure on any other work they're doing for the company, and my guess is most boards who hire a compensation consultant, that compensation consultant won't be doing any other work for the company. So your point is part of what's progressing. The other point Daniel Goleman writes about in a book called Vital Lies and Simple Truth, and it's called Unanimous Illusion. But you're right, it takes a certain amount of courage for somebody to say, in a way that's tactful, to question our assumptions, especially when times are really good. So the unanimous illusion comes when one or two strong people on the board, sometimes I see this, one or two strong people on the board, and they have a very impressionable background, maybe they worked for a really big company. But the question is, especially in risk intelligence, is that experience that that person has aligned with what the company is going to or happening? So you have to have more discretion and more what I call explicit conversations. So I'm getting the cue over here for David. We got to...
You need the big gold hook. No, you've done a great job, Tracy. I know there were more questions. What I'd like to do is let's take a 10-minute break. We'll rebuild the stage. It's very complicated. And then we will have the panelists up here. And then I'd like to take the questions that you have, and we'll start with those, if that works for you, Michael. And because let's get the conversation, but let's get more than just Tracy's view. So if that works for you guys, let's take about 10 minutes. Perfect time to grab some beverages, and we'll be back.